Welcome, guys. Thanks for listening. Participate, subscribe, whatever. Anyway, let's begin. I think it's a pressing issue of intellectuality and the manner of approach. Something that was naturally supposed in colleges and universities for centuries, especially the Islamic tradition, but as well in the Western, of like the approach towards intellectuality, because it's almost as important as the content, the knowledge, and whatnot, because we're going to see why, but mostly because it lacks the disciplined performance that finalizes and actualizes to a practical solution and finally to the real world, as it were. You know, the common proletarian fight against intellectuality is that it's not real in some sense. It doesn't come out. It's almost like the illusions or the leisure of one who doesn't participate, and that is somewhat of a true statement. And the argument against that is that eventually the theoretical framework does manifest into the structural environment and quote unquote the street. It reaches the street eventually, and if the theoretical framework or the intellectual pursuit has no bearing on an eventual outcome, which, by the way, we cannot define, who's to know the future, that some wary mathematical formula will somehow become important. So it's not meant to be known, but it's definitely, we could create a cross-reference system between the two realms, one which would possibly have a practical manifestation, such as, let's say, the psychological department of universities. Like there is a true measure from there to general society, and then there's the lack of practicality. But the point of the matter is that should be the end goal and pursuit of intellectuality. But before that can happen, it requires a disciplined measure in order to access an arena that's distinct and personable. And so if one were to analyze a situation, whatever it may be, provide a model upon a situation, one needs at foremost the parameters of the situation. That should be clear to all. Without parameters, we could always move between realms. If I'm studying one room of a house and I don't distinctly argue for the separation of that room for the purpose of study, then at some point or another, I'm going to deviate to another room. Yet I am proposing the stabilization of my argument to be within the room. So it's fine to make the claim on all of universality, you know. One can't do that. But if they choose to participate in a distinct measure of intellectuality, of contextual information, then by all means it needs to be correlated to a specific department. And if not, then it's proclaiming to be one thing whilst it's becoming another thing. And so that's a pressing issue. But as well, there is the notion of not only the discipline nature, but also the recognition of when and where to suppose the input to broader spectrums, right? If you're studying the room and you remain studying the room at all times to a point where you're never leaving the study of that room, then it has no benefit on the bearing of the house, the bearing of the structure, the bearing of any purpose that is beyond the intrinsic state of whatever you're studying. And so it's like the Greek extremism of knowledge, where, you know, knowledge is for the sake of itself, but more so that knowledge in itself is immortal, but also because it's immortal, it's like a rock. It's like it loses its personable value and thus its practical value. And so without that practical ability to manifest ultimately, then there is no grounding of an intellectual tradition as we know it, despite the fact that we could almost say that Hellenic tradition is foremost in the current era, but still that extreme perspective of unavailable, unabashful knowledge that has no practical ability because it is not available to be utilized. It's not available to be capitalized, using another negative association which should be positive. If things weren't capitalized upon, they would have no capital, and thus they would have no social value. If it had no social value, it would not be able to be contained through generations. What has not been printed through presses and through the market exchanges of those dynamics, they were lost. They weren't, we could even say they weren't even found within the social environment. You know, Socrates is this great example of this, where he sits in the marketplace and reduces people's supposition of whatever they think they stand upon, but he doesn't perform any sort of market value to exchange for better ideas or for how ideas could manifest, almost as if it was a critique on both ideas themselves and their capitalization, which in some sense is a denigration of society. It's also the necessary preliminary stage to intellectuality, for if one begins, by looking at a practical problem, they have no theoretical basis because they've already entered into the problem before they've entertained a broader contextual environment of study. There's a reason why the professor needs to sit in a university in some strange location to be in association with the regular city and do their study, because they need to sit behind the desk away from the practical ramifications, such that they're able to expand the horizon that's unavailable at the practical edge. But more so, it's important that the discipline remains intrinsic to its original state, which is set by parameters. So if it's intellectual study of statistics, it is at its furthest regard going to be a statistical value. Now, how that value is approached is outside the discipline of statistics, and if anything is the philosophical department, meaning what do we do with that value, or the corporate value, how do we capitalize on that statistic value. And the same thing for the medical field, which is of the contemporary contention, but is the same as any other discipline, where, okay, that's the medical value, but is that the statistical value? And is that the statistical value? So the medical value is, it's like a mechanic. That's the medical value, but do you want to fix your car? Should you fix your car? Is that the most important thing to fix your car? Is driving itself important? Is the body the focal point? Is longer life the focal point? Is shorter life the focal point? Is competency the focal point? These are outside the medical field. And so the medical value could just say what the biological study of success or denigration might be. And then the statistical value is the reality that might be in the future, which the medical scientist doesn't know, because he doesn't look at future. He looks at the present process, right? The statistical value can confer with the medical value, but it doesn't have to. And then there's the political value. Do you let go of some of your citizens to the horrors of war to help the others, right? That's not a medical value. The medical value would be to be Hippocratic and follow that ethic of healing as much as you can. And so whoever they may be. And surely not to begin war. And so that's the political value. The political value can use the medical value. Doesn't have to. It can confer with it. It doesn't have to. And so each of these disciplines are distinct for their roles, right? Prudency is a political value, right? Prudency is not a medical value. Prudency is a good trait for a manager. It is terrible for a skilled worker. So knowledge is great for a theorizer. It's terrible for one who needs to practically follow an implication, because the knowledge is just a distraction from it. And so intellectuality itself is first the study of what parameters you've set forth and what is negotiable in this discussion and what is not negotiable. What is not negotiable is outside the room. What is negotiable is within the room. Of course, there is going to be the discussion of when and where the professor must go back to the city and figure out how to apply his methods, or see where his methods have gone wrong, or make sure he's aligned initially of the data, and so on and so forth. And so that's an important study, and I really hope it's a pressing issue. It's almost like every other intellectual argument consists of a lack of distinct parameters, and so there's almost no available negotiation, because how could you negotiate a universal supposition that somehow planks itself at a specific position all the while? It's just it's a contradiction of terms. It's a contradiction of study, and so there is no negotiation other than the quietness and humility that they might purport some important aspect that has no logical sequence. And so it should be furthered.